Welcome everyone to JIJ's 11th webinar since October 7th. We're coming to you live today from Jerusalem, and I'm joined by Monique Bigro. She is our Director of U.S. Policy and Diplomacy. She happens to be in the same office as I am today, but in another room so our mics don't cause feedback. Monique has flown in from the New York area to spend a week working in person with the JIJ team, with the rest of the team here, and to visit the communities that were hit hardest by the Hamas massacre. She also is here to get a better understanding of the Israeli perspective on our continuing war for survival. Monique, welcome. Welcome to Jerusalem.
Thanks so much, Lydia. This has really been a profound and meaningful trip for me so far. I've been speaking with a lot of combat soldiers during this trip in between, meetings, and many of them have recently returned from reserve duty. Some of them have been really gracious to sit with me for several hours at a time. Our conversations have really driven home for me that Israel is fighting a war that it didn't want, a war that it didn't start, and a war that is truly existential for the survival of the state of Israel. So I'm just glad to be here to bear witness to it. And I kind of wish that everyone who was still skeptical about October 7th or critical of the Israeli army could have been able to participate as a fly on the wall in some of these conversations.
We're really glad that you're here too, to see these things firsthand and to be able to take back with you to the US what is happening. For all of you that are joining us, we have organized today's webinar in response to your questions, emails, direct messages, and comments that you left on our social media. We're hearing from you that the media narrative outside of Israel can be warped, confusing, fragmented, and that you're really not sure which sources of information you can trust. We're also hearing you say that young people, especially young people under the age of 30, are being radicalized for Hamas on social media platforms such as TikTok. There was a recent poll in the United States that showed very strong American support for Israel at all age levels, except the younger population. Something like 43% of Americans aged 18 to 24 actually side with Hamas. Monique, this is just, it's hard for me to grasp. These people that are siding with Hamas are not just concerned about civilians who are suffering in Gaza, and there are civilians suffering in Gaza. And they are not critical of Israeli policies or war tactics. They are straight up pro-Hamas, and they don't think Israel should exist. Living in America, does this track with your experience to date?
Yeah, it does, unfortunately. And I think that the surge in anti-Semitism on college campuses has been pretty well documented at this point.
Mhm.
But I want to highlight that the trend is actually rippling into younger ages that are not necessarily picked up on surveys. So every American kid that gets a smartphone from their parents is turning pro-Hamas. And these are kids who are 9, 10, and 11 years old. And they're learning that it's cool to admire Osama bin Laden, that October 7th was fake, that Israel is committing, quote, genocide in Gaza, and that the only solution is intifada revolution.
It's shocking. It's shocking when we hear and understand what is happening to the youngest of us and that have access and are exposed to cell phones and media. And it's shocking. I'm thankful that my children are older now, and I pray for my grandchildren. But that's what we are talking about today. That's the information that we want to bring to all of you, is how to stand up for Israel when the world wants you to sit down. In preparation, we asked many of you, our closest supporters, to send in advance some of the toughest questions and twisted narratives that you have faced. In response, we've received emails referencing some of the most upsetting things that are being chanted on American campuses. So I'm going to group some of these chants together and give you, Monique, a chance to unpack them for us. Um, then when we get to live audience questions as well, if you're listening now, if you're participating, we encourage you to make use of the Q&A function. We would love to hear from you if you didn't have a chance to send your question in earlier. So let's get to it. There is a popular chant on American colleges campuses right now that goes like this: "We don't want no two-state, we want 48." Or, "We don't want no two-state, we want all of it." Monique, what does this mean?
So, what I find most troubling about chants like this is that they reveal that the true objectives of the Palestinian nationalist movement. So, there are a lot of world leaders who like to pretend that all the Palestinians really object to is the quote occupation or the settlements, or all they really want is sovereignty within the 1967 borders. But the reality, when we hear chants like this, is that they want all of it. They want to erase Israel from the map and they want to go back to 1948. And this is what they mean when they also say things like resistance by any means possible. What they mean is that if the only way that Palestine can be freed is at the cost of 7 million dead Jewish people, then so be it.
That's a call for Jewish genocide.
Yeah, it's a call for Jewish genocide. And the crazy thing is that people feel like they're the good guys when they say it.
How can that even be possible?
I think we can't be naive about the Palestinian nationalist movement. It has a narrative that sounds really good. The narrative is that everything was fine before 1948. The Arabs and the Jews lived peacefully side by side. The Arabs were super welcoming to all of the Jewish refugees who were fleeing European anti-Semitism. And the real problem was this toxic idea called Zionism. And that's what messed everything up. So if we could just turn the clock back and we have a redo, then we would all be living in a secular, democratic, Arab majority utopia where the rights of Jewish and Christian minorities would be totally respected. There's a problem with this narrative, and it's completely false. For starters, there is no viable example of this anywhere in the world. The state of Israel actually stands alone in this region. It's the only country in the Middle East or North Africa where religious and ethnic minority populations are actually growing. Everywhere else in the region, they're shrinking.
Mm-hmm.
Also, nowhere else in this region is there a functional democracy where they're just flourishing, never mind growing, not one. So the Palestinian nationalist movement is inviting us with these chants to sacrifice Jewish survival in service of a fantasy that has really no precedent in this entire region. The other thing that this narrative really ignores is the Nebi Musa riots in 1920, the Hebron and the Safat massacres of 1929, and the Farhud massacre of 1941. And this narrative conveniently ignores the fact that the local Arabs in 1948, under the leadership of their Grand Mufti of Jerusalem, Amin al-Husseini, actually pressured the British to stop Jewish emigration to Israel in the middle of the Holocaust.
Can you explain more about the Farhud massacre? It is a significant part of Jewish history that many of our followers probably haven't heard about, and people need to understand it.
So it's the 1930s. And by this point in history, the city of Baghdad was about 30% Jewish. That's actually more Jewish than New York City. And New York City is perceived as a pretty Jewish place. The Jewish community had ancient roots in the city. They dated back to the 6th century before the Common Era. That's the time of the Babylonian exile. So we're talking biblical times. So Jewish presence in Iraq actually predates the Arabs by more than 1,000 years. Let's fast forward to 1941. What's happening is that the British and the Nazis are fighting each other in Iraq. And there's this Arab nationalist leader named Rashid Ali. He sides with the Nazis. The Nazis end up losing to the British. And in his humiliation, Rashid Ali and his buddies and with their newspapers and There are different mouthpieces in the culture. They orchestrate a campaign of revenge on the local Jewish community, which is perceived to be aligned with the British. And so they orchestrate a pogrom on June
Wait,
1st.
wait, excuse me. Can you explain what a pogrom is before we go on?
Yeah, basically, a pogrom is what happens when someone powerful whips up a mob of people to go in a big group and kill the Jews. It's basically an organized massacre. So back to the Farhud, it's June 1st, 1941, and there are thousands of Arabs rioting in the Jewish neighborhoods of Baghdad, destroying homes, shops, synagogues, murdering Jewish parents in front of their children, children in front of their parents, raping scores of Jewish women. It's basically Kristallnacht, the night of broken glass
Mhm,
in Germany,
mhm.
and October 7th all rolled into one. It's a pogrom. So by the time you get to 1951, which is 10 years later, there are only a few hundred Jewish people remaining in Baghdad. And it means everyone has fled to the new state of Israel. And actually, as of today in 2024, I think there's about 3 Jewish people who still live in Iraq.
We could discuss many of the other Arab countries that surround Israel where this happened as well. And it really challenges the narrative that Jewish people can live safely in Arab majority countries, doesn't it?
Yeah, the uncomfortable truth is that Arab nationalist movements are sympathetic at a fundamental level to Nazi ideology.
Mm,
And this is why Israeli soldiers operating in Gaza are finding Arabic translations of Hitler's manifesto, Mein Kampf. They're finding comic books that are filled with crude caricatures of Jewish people that honestly could be ripped straight out of a Hitler youth textbook. This is what they're finding in ordinary people's homes.
mhm, mhm. In the spirit of our webinar, how can supporters of Israel stand up to this false narrative of peace and brotherhood before 1948?
I'd say the best place to start is to learn about the Farhud and just challenge other people to learn about it as well.
If you want to look it up, by the way, after the webinar, it is spelled Farhud. Um, and back to our topics here. I have not heard a special chant for this, but there is a lot of rhetoric flying around accusing Israel, the IDF specifically, of committing war crimes. Please address that.
This one really drives me crazy. I have to talk about one of the combat soldiers that I met this week to really
Mhm,
make sense of this. On the plane ride over here from New York to Tel Aviv, I by chance sat next to a paratrooper reservist who had just 2 weeks prior finished 2 months of fighting in Khan Yunis, the southern city in Gaza. He had actually just come back to Florida to visit some distant cousins and decompress a bit and was on his way back to Israel. So he was willing to indulge a lot of my questions. I'm a pretty nosy person, and it was a long plane ride. So part of his unit's role was to go into areas in advance of the regular army. And the job is basically to be scout out what are the tricky spots, find some targets. So it was, I think, December 11th, and his unit was ordered to approach a vacant United Nations school.
mhm,
It was vacant. A few days before, the Israeli army had issued several evacuation warnings. They had created humanitarian corridors so that the civilians could leave safely, and they had left. However, his unit did not want to approach the UN school. They had learned from the campaign in the northern part of Gaza that most UN facilities had been converted into military assets by Hamas.
mhm, mhm,
But the laws of war indicate that because it's a United Nations facility and it's a school, that it's a sensitive facility. So, under the laws of war, and the IDF's interpretation is that they require 2 separate sources of human intelligence indicating the presence of fighters before they can call in an airstrike. So, in practice, what that means is that they're close enough to see the enemy with their own eyes. So, they did. And as they approached the school, a squad of Hamas fighters emerged from a camouflage tunnel entrance, which was just a few meters from the UN school, and they threw an IED at his unit. And then there's a firefight that ensues. And in the space of about 5 minutes, 5 Israeli soldiers were killed, including a father of 3 small children whose wife had just given birth 1 week before October 7th. So his unit got a day of rest, I guess you could call it, inside of Gaza, just to grieve a little bit. They were not able to attend the funerals of their friends and brothers. And the next day, the IDF authorized an airstrike on the building so that it could bulldoze 30 feet below its foundations to access that tunnel, which Hamas had used to ambush them. And his orders were to go into the tunnel. And, I said, well, first you send in the robots or the dogs, right? And he said, there's not enough robots and dogs for all of the tunnels in Gaza. So basically 2 days after his friends died, he had to go into the tunnel from which their killers had emerged. So this is the reality. Gaza is the most complex combat environment in the world. And Hamas built this complex battlefield, and Hamas intentionally rigged it in order to maximize civilian casualties. And nevertheless, the IDF is going above and beyond its own duties under the laws of war in order to minimize harm to civilians. And it has actually succeeded in dismantling about 60 to 70% of the Hamas battalions at this point, with the lowest combatant to civilian casualty ratio in the history of modern warfare. I wish that's the story that people would be able to see and hear with their own eyes. But unfortunately, that's not the story the media is telling.
No, it's not. Not at all. So another popular chant. Hey, hey, you can't hide. You're committing genocide. And a related chant that was heard by my sister as she walked through a mob in Brooklyn was, Israel, what do you say? How many kids have you killed today?
So this is the oldest trick in the anti-Semitic playbook, and it's called a blood libel. And I want to give everyone an example of how blood libels work. Let's go back to 1903 to Kishinev. There's a massive pogrom. So Kishinev at this time is part of the Russian Empire. Today we would call it Moldova. A Christian girl attempts suicide by poisoning herself, and her parents rush her to a Jewish hospital. They're seeking treatment for her. Unfortunately, she dies in the hospital. The newspapers claim that the Jews killed her to use her blood to make matzahs for Passover. And this is their laziest conspiracy theory. And for centuries, it has worked like a charm. So a mob gathers on Easter Sunday to ransack the Jewish neighborhoods. They kill, they rape, they beat people, they burn homes, businesses, synagogues. It's basically October 7th in Kishinev. This is the anatomy of a blood libel. And I also want to talk about the Al-Ali hospital bombing, because it follows the anatomy of a blood libel perfectly, but this time in the Gaza context. So on October 17th, if those of you who have been following us diligently since the war began, you'll remember on October 17th, the JIJ team was hosting a webinar. And we warned in that webinar that in prior Israeli conflicts with Hamas, the news media had a tendency to just repeat Hamas's casualty numbers as a fact, even though they couldn't verify it. But that generally a few months after the dust had cleared, the truth would come out, and it would reveal that the vast majority of the casualties were actually combatants and not civilians. So I think it was actually only about 30 minutes after we signed out of that webinar that Al Jazeera and the BBC blasted out those unverified headlines claiming that Israel had bombed the Al-Ali hospital, killing 500 civilians. What happened next was that riots broke out just hours later in Hebron and in Turkey and across the Arab world. And about a little over a week later, you all remember the mob that stormed a Russian airport in Dagestan looking for Jews to kill. Now, it took some time for the truth to emerge, and the truth really painted a different picture. It turned out it wasn't an Israeli airstrike. It was a misfired Palestinian Islamic Jihad rocket. Once it was clear that Israel was not at fault, suddenly we learned that the rocket didn't actually hit the main part of the hospital. It hit a parking lot that was adjacent to the hospital. And it turned out that instead of 500 casualties, we were looking at a few dozen. So the whole thing was an absolute tragedy, and it's a waste of human potential. but it was also a sterling example of how a lie can make its way halfway around the world while the truth is just tying its shoelaces.
Yeah, it is amazing how fast false information can spread. But I don't want to skip over the genocide accusation in that chant. Is there any credibility to this accusation?
Okay. Speaking as a lawyer, words have meanings, and genocide is actually a textbook description for what Hamas did on October 7th, not the Israeli operation in Gaza. So the only thing that matters when you talk about genocide as a legal matter is intent. Does one party in a conflict have the intent to destroy in whole or in part another people group? So let's think about this. Hamas, in its charter, they make very clear that the sole purpose of Hamas is to pursue the total annihilation of Israel and the Jewish people. So I want to encourage anyone who's listening to go look it up and actually take the time to read the 1988 Hamas Charter for yourself. It's a genocidal document. I just want to be crystal clear. October 7th is a textbook case of genocide. Here's what's interesting about this chant. So we're a few months into this, and this accusation of Israel committing genocide, but Hamas somehow being resistance fighters, has actually developed this new discourse in the West. And I've seen this on social media just this week, that the state of disability rights in America is genocide. I've seen that climate change is genocide. I've seen that the disparities in public school funding is genocide. Really, if anything is genocide, then nothing is genocide. This rhetoric and this discourse is actually rendering the concept meaningless. And we have to remember that the word genocide was coined by Raphael Lemkin, who was a Polish Jewish Holocaust survivor. If anyone understands what a real genocide is, it's the Jewish people. If any nation understands what genocide truly is, it's the one place in the world that is home to Holocaust survivors. Another point I want to make on this genocide topic is that I actually see a more sinister claim gaining traction. And it's that Israel itself, its very existence, is genocide. I actually saw a UN human rights expert post this claim on social media today. He said Israel is genocide. And so I guess my question, Lydia, to you is, what's the implication of saying that Israel is genocide?
Well, that we, the Jewish people, should just roll over and die.
Yeah, basically. That's it.
Another sobering. Before we jump to the Q&A from the audience, I know you are all aware, or I hope you're all aware of our efforts, and we want to let you know that JIJ has a lot to contribute to the topic of genocide, and at a very high level. I'm so proud of our team. In December, we took our team and first responders to Geneva to present evidence of Hamas's atrocities to UN officials, foreign ambassadors, and the Red Cross. We presented a detailed report, including graphic and detailed photos of victims' bodies. This was the first professional legal report that they had received from Israel on the October 7th events. We have presented similar evidence to UN officials who have traveled to Israel to investigate Hamas atrocities. And on March 21st, for the 55th session of the UN Human Rights Council, we are headed back to Geneva to hold a very important event on the grounds of the UN headquarters on the topic of genocide. We are bringing experts on this topic from the Hebrew University, along with a survivor of the Nova Festival, where she will give her testimony.
Yeah, and I think it's really important to just highlight that these kinds of there's a lot of careful work that goes on behind the scenes in preparation for these kinds of delegations, and this is a very high level, high pressure event, and we really count on support from our donors in order to do things like this and to be a very lonely voice in these halls of the United Nations in supporting and standing up for Israeli civilians. So I want to encourage you, if you have not considered making a gift to JIJ before, that you go to jij.org/donate and consider making a generous gift in support of this really important event that's coming up in Geneva. So Lydia, why don't we jump to some of the audience questions, because we really want to make sure people feel well equipped to deal with the emerging reality.
So, question one from our audience: why are so many amazing young people in my life turning pro Hamas? Why are the Palestinians and Hamas viewed as underdogs and Israel viewed as the big bad bully? You can put that together or answer them separately, Monique.
I mean, obviously, everybody loves an underdog. If you look only, it depends on how you look. If you only look at Gaza, then yeah, Israel looks like the big bad bully, especially because Israel is succeeding in the effort. But if you zoom out, you see that Israel is this tiny little sliver of 7 million Jewish people and 2 million Arab citizens, surrounded by 500 million Arabs who have historically not been friendly to the idea of Jewish survival. And you see that on October 7th, as Hamas invaded, Hezbollah, which is far better equipped than Hamas, began firing rockets directly into Israeli territory. You can see that Israel has a noose around its neck. It is surrounded by Iranian proxies and is actually fighting a multi-front war. We're fighting a war on the Gaza front, on the Lebanese front. There are Islamic State radicals that have taken up territory in Syria and Iraq, and they're causing problems. There's the Houthis in Yemen. And then there's Iran, which is on the verge of becoming a nuclear power and which is financing and coordinating and directing all of this activity. So if you zoom out a little bit, you see that we're really in a fight for our lives. And sadly, the people of Gaza are being used as pawns in a much bigger game. So it's an understandable position. It's related to also this question of like, when does history begin? And as we talked a little bit earlier, the Palestinian nationalist movement would like for history to begin in 1948, or maybe if they're being generous in 1920. But Jewish memory in this region goes back centuries, it goes back millennia. And that really informs the Israeli perspective.
Thank you, Monique. We have another question. What about Jewish anti-Zionists? How do I relate, was the question, to friends that I have that are Jewish and yet they're anti-Zionist?
There's a tantalizing proposition offered by the anti-Zionist movement that there's a perfect set of rules by which Jewish people should play, and if they do, they'll be safe. And it's been appealing to Jewish people across different points in history. Many of the Jews who lived in Baghdad before the Farhud were not Zionists. They would even call themselves anti-Zionists. They would say, no, we don't belong in Israel. We belong here. We have roots here going back to the Babylonian exile. But their neighbors proved to them otherwise. They proved that your political sentiments and your willingness to, kind of throw your own people under the bus doesn't really matter at the end of the day. I have to say that it was a real wake-up call for me a few weeks ago. I was wandering around my hometown, and I went into an independent bookstore and saw a copy of Der Judenstaat, The Jewish State, by Theodor Herzl. He wrote this in 1896, and I had actually never read it. I knew of it, I knew what the concepts were, but I never sat down and read it cover to cover. And to read that as an American Jew after October 7th was chilling. I saw that the trends that Herzl was observing in Europe in 1896 are present in North America today. And the time from 1896 until the Nuremberg laws was about 30 years. It really showed me that there are forces at work in our seemingly civilized and enlightened society that are actually part of a pattern of history. I think that's what's been so shocking for the vast majority of American Jews who are pro-Israel, is that we got lulled a little bit into a feeling that this is what happened to our grandparents, but we're in a new reality and things will be fine. And now we're experiencing the return of history. And my feeling about Jewish anti-Zionists is that they are just late to the wake-up party.
Thank you, Monique. Question was just typed in. Do you think the government of the United States is underestimating the existential threat of so many young people getting brainwashed to be pro-Hamas? And this doesn't exactly relate to the topic, but it does, because it's important for our viewers.
Yeah, so there's some things that I am hopeful about when it comes to American politics and things that I'm not hopeful about when it comes to American politics. One of the great things about the American political system is that there are so many ways of counting power. We have the Electoral College for choosing the president. We have two different sides of Congress in which votes are counted differently. We have local and state. We have representation at numerous levels. And we have checks and balances, and that's good. We also have a Republican democracy in which everyone has to run for office, and it makes them mostly committed to their short-term political survival. And they're thinking about their next campaign. And there's a tendency to kick looming social issues, to like kick the can down the road and just wait until it becomes an existential problem. And I don't want to be an alarmist, but I'm in agreement with any question that says that, you know, this is a looming issue. I would like to be hopeful, as I'm sure many people on this webinar are, that many of these young people are pro-Hamas, can and will mature and grow and get life experience. Things, facts and realities will come forth that will challenge this narrative. But I'm also concerned that as they grow and learn, that these are some fundamental assumptions about the world are taking hold in their mind. And in 20 to 25 years, these are the people who will be in charge of the institutions of American power. So I don't know if that's a great answer, but those are my thoughts on that topic.
Thank you. Another question from a viewer. This is hard. How would you answer someone who's Jewish, who cries out saying, Israel has to stop because they are killing babies, hundreds of babies dead in the streets?
It's true that civilians are suffering.
Every life is,
and
every
life
casualty is a tragedy. Yes.
The leaders of Hamas made exceptionally clear that they were going to repeat what they did on October 7th, and that they would do it again and again and again. And it's a little bit of a luxury belief for someone who doesn't live right next door to a terrorist organization to suggest that you should just somehow adjust to that, to routine massacres and pogroms as just kind of an order of life. Because dismantling the terrorist organization that's on your border is going to also lead to suffering of innocent people. It's a luxury belief. And speaking as a North American, as a citizen of the United States, we have peaceful borders. We may have issues on our borders, but we don't have terror states on our borders. We have not had a war fought in our country for over 100 years. And so we are far away from the realities of war. And what I would say to someone like that, if she's Jewish, is to go to Israel with an open mind and to talk to as many people as she can from as many perspectives as she can, to talk with someone of the 125,000 internally displaced Israeli civilians who are still stuck in hotel rooms because it's still not safe to go back to their homes, to talk to some of the soldiers who have returned from reserves, to talk to some of the hostage families. You can go to Hostage Square in Tel Aviv and meet the family members of hostages who are there every single day sharing the stories of their loved ones. And to talk to Arab Israeli citizens about the benefits of living in the only democracy in the Middle East. And even talk to Palestinians and people who disagree and come to see that the whole picture is completely different than what you're reading in the news and what's getting fed to you on social media.
Thank you. I want to remind everybody that you can go to jij.org. We have a lot of materials that you might not be aware of. We have fact sheets. We have regarding UNRWA, regarding Hamas, regarding militarization of child soldiers in Gaza. We have information that it would be helpful for you when you are talking to people, when you're talking to your friends and your neighbors. You can go back and watch past webinars. We do a lot of research, and we appreciate each of you partnering with us. And we ask you to continue to do so, especially for the coming event that we talked about earlier in Geneva. Okay, I'm just checking a few more questions.
Yeah, I want to take a stab at one of them.
Sure.
We have a question about dealing with a brainwashed individual. It says many young people in the USA, they get brainwashed. How do you deprogram a brainwashed individual? I'm not an expert on this.
I was nervous to answer that one, to be honest, Monique.
But I will
Go
say
ahead.
that the brainwashing is mostly being delivered through this portal. I
Yes.
don't know the level of influence you have on this person's life, but if you can get them to agree just on a basic level that this thing is not helping them in their life, it's probably not contributing to their mental health. They're not able to sleep as well. They're not able to live in the present. And to challenge them to take a little break, maybe for a week, maybe for a month from this thing, this indoctrination device, and to have real human conversations with real people affected by this conflict, and to see if maybe their perspective shifts ever so slightly. I put hope in that. I've seen minds change when they're not getting bombarded with propaganda constantly, but when they're having to deal with real human beings who are affected. The challenge with this war is that social media demands something called snackable content. And the algorithm loves snackable content, and it loves outrage, and it loves fear. And there's also a propaganda industry on the ground in Gaza. There are people who are on the payroll for Hamas who go around to try to get the worst possible images. Sometimes they're faked, sometimes they're real. It's almost impossible to tell because all you get is a little couple second snippet, and then you get text and you get music and you get all this stuff which sort of, propagandizes you. So that's why I think the best solution is get away from the phone.
Good advice, Monique. From Felisa, we have a question. What can we do about legacy media bias reporting, such as the CBS 60 Minutes bias narratives from last Sunday? This isn't the first. We received questions by email about this as well.
I didn't see the particular 60 Minutes story you're referring to. I was possibly here already. So I'll have to watch that and see what it says. Here's what I want everyone to be aware of. Jerusalem, I believe, I could be wrong, has one of like the highest per capita ratios of journalists in the world. There is an industry here, and there is a little bit of an obsession here in the news media. And when you have that many journalists, they have to write about something, right? And they tend to repeat what others say. They tend to copy paste other stories. And they also cannot promote any factual information that doesn't serve the Hamas narrative, especially if that news agency has people on the ground in Gaza. If the Associated Press, Reuters, BBC, CNN, or I'm not sure exact ABC, you have to kind of ask yourself, do they have stringers and do they have staff on the ground in Gaza? If so, they have to play by the Hamas rules. And there's a concern in that newsroom, that editor who is approving or not approving certain content about how is this going to blow back on our colleague in Gaza. And that's just something that has to be factored in as you consider this. I want to encourage people to look at Israeli sources of news. And you can look at Israeli sources of news from the left, the right, and the center. And
Mm.
I encourage everyone to always look at news from as many perspectives as possible. But don't just look at American sources of news, because they're also only reporting things that interest an American audience. Whereas I will say the Israeli coverage of this conflict covers also the human dimension on the Israeli side and has the effect of humanizing Israelis. And not just hostages, not just survivors from the Nova Festival, but first responders, like the first responders we work to and bring into the United Nations, like the internally displaced, like the civilians who are just assisting in covering up the gaps in society, and like the people who are coming to babysit children, so that moms whose husbands have been away for months can, get a little bit of a break. When you watch that coverage, the Israeli coverage, you get a feeling of how focused and how existential this war really is for the people of Israel.
Thank you, Monique. Uh, we're just about out of time for this evening. Is there anything else you want people to know? Something, a nugget that they can take away?
I want you to understand that one of the reasons why the propaganda is so potent this time is that the United Nations launders a lot of the Hamas propaganda and repeats it as fact. And that's a dynamic that you should be attuned to in the news media. Whenever you see casualty figures, whenever you see, unverified reports, even when you see photos, you have to, and especially if it's quoting a United Nations official, you have to understand that the United Nations sources of information are not neutral sources of information. I want to, if I can take a little bit of time, Lydia, I just want to go into sort of the mechanics of
Oh,
how.
absolutely.
Yeah.
It's important.
Yeah, I mean, JIJ has United Nations consultative status, so that means that we actually engage directly with several, senior UN officials, and they've kind of admitted to us how the information flow works. So,
Mhm.
a bomb falls in Gaza. Was it an Israeli airstrike or was it a misfired Hamas rocket? It's unclear. People are killed. Were they fighters? Were they civilians? Was it a mix? Unclear. A few hours later, the Hamas Minister of Health will send a list with names and ID numbers of the dead to his counterpart in the United Nations. And according to this list produced by Hamas, let's say it says that Israel killed 51 civilians in a single airstrike and there were 0 fighters killed. You have to remember when you see these numbers, we are over 130 days into this war. The state of Israel, with all of its manpower and its technology, still hasn't finished identifying the victims from October 7th. Is the Hamas Minister of Health still in Gaza? Or has he fled through the tunnels to Egypt? It's unclear. So how does Hamas know exactly who died in that building in such a brief time span, along with their ID numbers? It's really unclear. But here's what happens, because the UN doesn't have its own way to verify this information. It has UNRWA people there, but UNRWA is social workers and teachers. It's not investigators. And so they don't really have anyone they can rely on to verify the information. So what they do is they end up publishing a tweet or putting a line in a report where they express horror over these credible reports that maybe 51 civilians were killed today. And the hashtag is not a target. What happens is that the journalists around the world will pick up the headline, and the headline won't be Hamas says that 51 civilians were killed. It will say the UN reports that 51 civilians were killed by Israel. And so I would just want you to keep in mind that this becomes an information war of made up numbers. And those made up numbers have been intentionally manufactured in order to inflame the sympathies of ordinary people around the world who don't know any better. So I just think it's important when people start throwing numbers around that you mention, like, what is the source of those numbers? And if the source of the numbers is the United Nations, you must understand that that means the source of the numbers is the Hamas Minister of Health. And it deserves to be questioned. So I
And
guess I
can
want to leave everybody with a bit of healthy skepticism.
you that brought to mind the charges against Israel at the ICJ.
Mhm.
How did South Africa come
Yeah.
to
So
file that?
South Africa put together the state of South Africa put together about an 85-page filing before the International Court of Justice accusing Israel of committing genocide. And most of their evidence is based on UN data, UN official statistics,
Mhm.
which comes from Hamas. So again, you see how, basically, look, having seen a little bit of the inner workings of the UN system, um, I've seen that many of the agencies of the UN have not only been infiltrated by Hamas, like we've seen with UNRWA, at least a dozen of them participated in the October 7th massacre. There's a UN employee who actually, we have on CCTV footage, him picking up the body of a dead Israeli civilian and dragging him into his personal car to take him back to Gaza. There are thousands of UN employees that are official members of Hamas. Martin Griffiths, he's the United Nations relief chief. He actually went on television 2 weeks ago on Sky News, I believe it was, to say that, of course, Hamas is on the UN payroll because, according to us, they're just a political group. They're not a terrorist organization. This really is the crux of the problem, by the way, that the UN still does not categorize Hamas as a terrorist organization. And this is something JIJ is working on in Washington, D.C. and in New York City, and working with heads of missions in the UN system to push for this, because this would bring the transparency and the legitimacy and the neutrality to the UN system that it claims to possess in this context. So you have to understand in this context that many of the major agencies of the UN, they haven't just been infiltrated by Hamas, but they've actually been systematically instrumentalized in that they serve in this way that I just explained to you as this propaganda outlet for a jihadist terrorist organization. And it's all being bankrolled by Western donor countries. And since we're on this point, Lydia, I just want to remind everybody we actually have a petition to defund
Yes.
UNRWA. I'm sure those of you, who are on today have been watching in the news all of these allegations against UNRWA. We've been following this very closely. We believe that there should not be any additional funding to UNRWA unless or until the whole thing is radically reformed and restructured. We're really pleased that it looks like the United States might be on the verge of defunding UNRWA, but we really are gathering petition signatures so that we can help to push this over the edge and push for the needed reforms. There's a concern, which is a understandable one. Well, without UNRWA, who will help the civilians in Gaza?
Right.
They're the only act in town. And here's what's so troubling about that. UNRWA appears to be, from an outsider's view, the only option, and it is because Hamas wants it that way. UNRWA is one of the only humanitarian aid agencies that has been willing to play by Hamas's rules, which are see no evil, hear no evil, speak no evil, and also let enough of our people on our payroll so that we have, the inside know-how of what you're doing, and we have some influence
Mhm.
over your affairs. There are actually, despite all my criticisms of the UN system, there actually are UN organizations that are not routinely infiltrated by terrorists, especially the World Food Program, which has been doing really important work in Gaza, even this week, arranging airdrops to try to
Mhm.
circumvent some of the Hamas's diversion of the humanitarian aid. So I just want you guys to be clear that we're not suggesting that there should be no humanitarian aid and that people don't have a right to food, medicine, shelter, clean water, but simply that we're fooling ourselves if we think that UNRWA actually is the solution to this problem, when in fact there are some alternative agencies. So please go to jij.org, share with your friends that petition, sign the petition. It helps us immensely in our advocacy efforts.
And again, you can go to JIJ's YouTube channel to find each of our past webinars, to find this one. We will be sending this out with a link once we're done here. Probably tomorrow, I would think it would come out. So please view again if you missed something, if there's information that you didn't quite get the first time, watch it again. Please share it with your friends. And Monique and I will say thank you for being with us. We pray for the release of the hostages. And until next time, I also want to say quickly, if we did not get to your question, if you didn't have time to send it, or if as we were speaking, another thought, another question arose, please email it to us. Let us know if you enjoyed this, if it was indeed helpful and equipping for you. And if requested, we can do some more, answer some more of your questions in the future. Thank you, Monique. It has been so nice to have you here in Israel with us. And well, we don't want your time to end, but this webinar needs to end. So thank you. Have a good evening, everybody.
להתראות.